Since the dawn of popular music as we know it, each generation has seen artists that managed to capture the sensibilities and values of their time. Two of the best examples of artists as zeitgeists are the Beatles and Radiohead, strikingly different bands that have grown to be one of the best ways to learn about what it was like to live in the 1960s and 2000s outside of a textbook. The music of the Beatles and Radiohead is innovative and unlike anything that came before. The bands set new standards for the sound and presentation of all music that would come after them, but what I am going to examine are the cultural factors behind how the Beatles and Radiohead were able to become two of the most important musical acts of all time. In order to understand how and why the Beatles achieved their fame, it's first important to understand how the culture of the 1960s allowed a globally popular band to arise. The baby boom began around 15 years before the Beatles started making music, and when they appeared on the scene there were seas of teenagers just waiting for cultural unification. In fact, the very concept of the teenager had just recently developed, and culture claimed by the teenage demographic was yet to emerge. Young people of the time didn't have the brands or art to relate to and represent them that our teenagers do now. Adults famously hated the Beatles for various reasons, which made it easy for teenagers to like them as an act of harmless yet thrilling rebellion. As such, the Beatles had their work cut out for them when it came to harnessing and developing the values of their generation.
The hottest musical group in Great Britain today is the Beatles. That's not a collection of insects, but a quartet of young men with pudding bowl haircuts and who spell Beatles B-E-A-T-L-E-S. They were all born during the Blitz in the Merseyside section of Liverpool, the toughest section of one of the toughest cities in the world. It's anybody's guess why the Beatles emerged from its cellar nightclubs to national prominence, but emerge they did. They've sold 2.5 million records and they earn $5,000 a week.
The Beatles first appeared on television in 1963. Other events of the year, including scandals in the British government, the Great Train hijacking, and an extremely cold winter, only helped make it easier for them to gain popularity as people sought refuge from their lives in the Beatles' music and personalities. Meanwhile, Radiohead's audience is smaller. There was no baby boom in the 1980s to skyrocket them towards global superstardom, and they hardly revolutionized popular music as we know it today, but an extremely large number of people rallied behind Radiohead as a voice for their generation that resulted in a success few others have seen. I think that Radiohead's legacy is inseparable from their music. Their music contains constant political and philosophical statements, and even though the Beatles' music is some of the best ever written, Radiohead's music was more of a factor in their rise to fame. Before they stopped touring in 1966, the Beatles used their good looks, personality, and charm to propel themselves towards fame, while the members of Radiohead avoid celebrity despite selling millions of records. Radiohead perfectly embodies the discomfort and loneliness that serves as the backdrop for the 21st century, and it's impossible to discuss them without touching on the sense of alienation that is conveyed through their music. Their emotional honesty and acceptance of the fact that they see life as being rather grim is a huge part of what makes them so good. We're often drawn to art that reflects what we feel. Radiohead perfectly represents and speaks to people who suffer from alienation from society, a condition that has only grown more common as the band's career progressed. They express political dissatisfaction often. While the Beatles' music is idealistic and depicts good, desirable experiences, listening to Radiohead is more a sort of catharsis than a look through rose-colored glasses. If the thesis of this video is true, that the best bands are able to represent the sensibilities of their time, that's a rather depressing idea. Radiohead's vocalist, Tom York, said that their early music was inspired by the speed of the world in the 1990s, something that's only increased in the last 20 years. The Beatles provided an escape for their contemporary audience by showing a different, more optimistic view than the world reflected at the time. Radiohead, however, offer a release for listeners, letting them know they're not alone in their cynicism and fear of society. Cynicism and fear born from the rise of the internet, the increasingly fast pace of the world, and the band's perspective that people were more alone than ever as a result of these things. They see the world through a lens of anxiety and discontent. The Beatles' music carries a message of self-improvement and acceptance of the world. The fact that they managed to be the most popular bands of their generation tells us a lot about the times they thrived in. The band's musical careers share similarities as well. They both started as purveyors of well-made pop music, and while their early work is good, their legacies wouldn't exist without their later work and the impact they've had on the industry outside of their music. Radiohead are more or less responsible for music streaming music as far back as 2000, while the Beatles revolutionized cover art forever in 1967 with the iconic art of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Radiohead popularized the now extremely common pay-what-you-want format in 2007, opening a new way of making money for independent artists that previously had no way of doing so. According to author Jonathan Gould, the Beatles' influence was so far-reaching that they became a catalyst for activism in social arenas. Both bands pioneered the musical landscape, and without them, the industry would be noticeably different. They sound almost nothing alike, but serve as zeitgeists for their times. The Beatles' relaxed, determined optimism and psychedelia is one of the best ways to learn about the 60s short of a textbook, and Radiohead's paranoia, exhaustion, and loneliness is one of the best ways to experience what it's like to live in the ever-changing society of the 21st century. Their music is down to earth. You always know what emotion you're supposed to feel when listening to either of them, despite sometimes abstract lyricism or experimental instrumentation. The music of the Beatles and Radiohead will go down in history alongside works such as George Orwell's 1984 and Diego Rivera's Murals as some of the best representations of a time in history ever created.